Protests break out in Colombo as Sri Lanka's new president tries to save the economy. Hello and welcome to VOA Asia Weekly. I'm your host, Jessica Stone, here in Washington. We'll get to that story in just a moment. But first, Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Joe Biden have held a call on Thursday to discuss Taiwan as well as the Russian war against Ukraine. This comes as House Speaker Nancy Pelosi reportedly plans to visit Taiwan. President Biden has said the U.S. military does not want her to go, while Beijing threatens to respond forcefully if she does. The most senior U.S. general, Mark Milley, met with other Indo-Pacific military leaders in Australia this week. Milley's trip is focused on China's accelerating military growth. Caroline Kennedy, the new U.S. ambassador to Australia, has had her first week on the job. Next week, she joins Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman on a high-profile diplomatic visit to the Solomon Islands. In May, the islands signed a security pact with Beijing. In his first State of the Union address, Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. vowed to slash poverty, rein in soaring food prices, and boost renewable energy. On Monday, Myanmar's military authorities executed 4 democracy activists. The men were sentenced to death in January after being accused of helping to carry out terror acts against the army that seized power in a coup last year. Sri Lanka's new president has promised to form an all-party government which is capable of obtaining a bailout from the International Monetary Fund. But so far, his actions have only further angered protesters. Luke Hunt reports for VOA from Colombo.
Sri Lanka has been sorely tested by protesters fed up with hyperinflation and fuel lines stretching for 2 to 3 kilometres, with motorists and thousands of tuk-tuk drivers forced to sleep out for days on end. That has been widely blamed on the ousted president who fled the country. Gotabaya Rajapaksa resigned his office from Singapore after hundreds of thousands of protesters marched on the presidential complex, where they even swam in the president's pool. His family had ruled Sri Lanka for 17 years. Ganeshan Vagnajara, a senior fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, says Sri Lanka's drastic plight is due to mismanagement and corruption.
Growth is at -4 to -6% in 2022, and inflation is between 50 and 70% this year.
Vagnajara also says accusations that China had laid a debt trap were exaggerated.
The total debt burden is something like $7.6 billion, which suggests a rising debt to China, but does not indicate that Sri Lanka is yet in a Chinese debt trap.
Wickremesinghe had promised to form an all-party government in a bid to solve the crisis, but instead he has promoted close allies of the ousted president to his cabinet. That includes the former Home Minister and former Rajapaksa school classmate Dinesh Gunawardena, who has been named Prime Minister. Protesters and Sri Lankan investigators have claimed that billions of dollars have been siphoned off into offshore bank accounts by associates of the Rajapaksas, leading to calls for an independent investigation into the family's wealth and an asset recovery program, although that could take years. Members of the Rajapaksa family dispute the charge. Luke Hunt for VOA News, Colombo, Sri Lanka.
Chinese President Xi Jinping has hosted his first foreign leader in Beijing since the Olympics this week. It is Indonesia's President Joko Widodo who met with President Xi in Beijing on Tuesday. The leaders pledged to increase trade and expand cooperation in infrastructure and food security. Finally, on VOA Asia Weekly, a first in space for Beijing, as the Wenchun space station module successfully docks onto China's space station while in orbit. The module allows for new science experiments, additional housing and life support. There is more room on board now, so 3 more taikonauts, or Chinese astronauts, will soon board the station. Thanks for watching VOA Asia Weekly. I'm Jessica Stone. See you next week.